Welcome back to the deep dive. You've sent over your source material, and today we are absolutely on a mission. We're going to build your ultimate formula sheet for core Python algorithms. We're moving past just basic operations and really digging deep into the logic you need for functions, for data structures, and even for complex stuff like recursion.
Exactly. We're boiling it all down to the essentials, the high-value knowledge you need for, a rapid revision. This isn't just about memorizing syntax. It's about algorithmic strategy. If you really get these structures, you can solve almost any programming challenge thrown at you.
We've laid this out into what we think are three indispensable pillars. First, function definitions and behavior, the absolute foundation of clean code. Second, we'll apply that to some crucial iterative algorithms for lists and matrices. And finally, we're going to tackle that elegant, but let's be honest, often intimidating power tool, recursion.
Right. We're going to synthesize the key definitions, and this is really important. Clarify the crucial distinctions. Things like variable scope, or the difference between just showing information versus actually returning usable data.
Okay, so let's start with that bedrock, Python functions. Let's start with the absolute fundamentals of modularity. Functions are defined with that def keyword. Their whole reason for being is to create reusable, self-contained blocks of code. Why do we keep hammering this idea of modularity?
Because it just simplifies complexity. I mean, think about it. If you have to debug some huge program, you don't want to be chasing code across 5 different files.
Right.
Modularity means you isolate one specific task, let's say, calculating a tax rate, into one function. If that tax rule ever changes, you only fix that one block of code.
Not 20 different places in your main program.
Exactly.
And as we're hitting the definitions, we have to nail this distinction. Parameters versus arguments. This trips people up all the time.
It does. Parameters are the abstract placeholders. They're the variables you define in the function signature. So if you write def calculateria, length, and width, those are your parameters. They don't have any real values yet.
But when you actually call that function, when you run calculateria 10, 5, the values you provide, the 10 and the 5, those are the arguments.
And what's really fascinating here is just how flexible Python is with those arguments.
Yeah.
You can pass them positionally, where the order matters.
Sure.
Or you can use keyword arguments. You can explicitly say with 5, length 10, and then the order doesn't matter at all.
Oh, and you can set default arguments too, right? In the definition itself.
Yes, which saves you from having to provide every single value every single time. It adds a ton of robustness to your code.
Okay, now let's dig into what might be the single most important behavior of a function. The difference between print and return. The sources used a washing machine analogy. And it's actually perfect. The function takes dirty clothes, the input processes them, and then it has to return clean clothes, the result.
It has to. Because if your function only uses print, all it does is display the result on the console. It doesn't actually pass a data value back to the program. And in Python, a function that finishes without hitting a return statement, it silently returns a very specific value. It returns none type.
That sounds pretty harmless, but I remember the first time a bug from a silent none-type return cost me, hours to find.
Yeah.
Why is that specific data type so dangerous when you're trying to chain things together?
Because none type basically means no value. It's a placeholder for nothing. So if you try to use that nothing, in a math calculation.
Like adding 10 to it.
Exactly. You call your function, it prints the number 5, and then you try to add 10 to that result. Python's going to throw type errors. It's telling you, I can't add an integer to this non-existent thing. The value is shown, but it was never actually returned.
So the power of return is that it passes the actual calculated variable, its value, and its correct data type, integer, string, whatever, back to the calling scope. It lets you build things. Without return, you basically stop the flow dead.
And this leads us perfectly into variable scope, local versus global. This is all about where those variables live and where they die. Variables that you defined inside a function. They only exist in that local scope. They're born when the function starts, and they vanish the second it returns.
And crucially, you can't get to those local variables from your main program. They are completely private to that function's little world.
Right. Global variables, on the other hand, are defined outside of any function. They're in the main body of the program, and they're accessible everywhere. You can read them from inside a function, no problem.
But changing them is a different story.
Changing them is where it gets tricky.
And here's where it gets really interesting. You can't just access a local variable from the outside, but you can use the global keyword inside a function to explicitly say, hey, I intend to modify that variable out in the global scope.
You can. It's a powerful tool. But, it's generally seen as poor practice to rely on it too much. It kind of breaks that whole idea of functions being self-contained, predictable modules.
But for a formula sheet, you just have to remember global is the key word that lets you make that crossover.
Perfect. So we know how to define functions, how to get usable data out of them with return. Now let's apply them. Let's see how functions use iteration to actually calculate those values. We're moving to algorithms for lists and matrices.
Let's start with two really fundamental list algorithms, finding the minimum or the maximum element. And a quick tip from the sources. Don't name your variable min or max.
Right, because those are built-in Python functions. You'll overwrite them. Just use a short placeholder like m. The logic here is it's very straightforward, but it's foundational for so many other algorithms. First, you initialize your placeholder, m, and you just set it equal to the first element of the list, L0.
You're just assuming the first one is the minimum or maximum until you find something that proves you wrong.
Precisely. Then you use a range loop, so for I in range len, to step through the rest of the list by its index. For a minimum search, you're just checking if the current element, li, is less than m.
And if it is, you update m.
You update m, and for maximum, you just reverse the comparison. It's simple, it's effective, and it's index-based.
Okay, next up, list manipulation. Let's say we're building a function, we'll call it append first DL. It takes two lists, L1 and L2, and it has to return a brand new list that contains L2's elements first, followed by L1's.
The core structure here is so important for understanding procedural logic. You have to start by initializing an empty list. Let's call it new list.
Okay.
Then you perform the appending in the correct order. You must use a dedicated loop, a range loop, to run completely through L2, appending each of its elements to new list. Then and only then do you start a separate second loop to go through L1 and append its elements.
I know modern Python has shortcuts for this. You could just use the plus operator or extend. So why is understanding this two-loop structure still so mandatory for, a high-level revision sheet?
Because in bigger, more complex algorithms, you're not just combining simple lists.
Yeah.
You might be combining partial data structures or applying some complex logic before you append each item. Understanding that you need to finish the full iteration of L2 using its own indices 0, 1, 2 before you start a fresh iteration on L1 with its own indices 0, 1, 2. That's the key structural lesson. It forces you to think sequentially.
Good point. Okay, moving on to more complex data structures, matrices. In Python, a matrix is just a list of lists, and the key thing to remember is indexing. It's always matrix row column.
Always. And we need two essential functions here for our toolkit, the dot product and full-on matrix multiplication. The dot product is the building block. It's simple. It takes two lists or vectors that have to be the same length.
Right.
You initialize a running total, answer, equals 0. Then you use a single loop to iterate through the dimension, and inside you just calculate answer, answer plus UAV. That's it. That's the core calculation for all of this.
And now for matrix multiplication, or matmul. This is where our whole discussion about modularity from the beginning really pays off big time.
Oh, absolutely. It's a notoriously complex algorithm to write out in just one giant block of nested loops.
It's what you called index hell.
It is. It really is. If you try to do it all at once, you have three nested loops, I, J, and K.
Yeah.
And it becomes almost impossible to track which index is for the row, which is for the column, and which is for the dot product part.
So we break it down. We use helper functions.
We have to. The main matmul function should first initialize a 0 matrix of the correct size. Maybe it calls a little helper function called initmat.
Okay.
Then it uses the critical nested loops, the outer loop for the results row, the inner loop for the results column J.
And here's the beautiful part.
This is the synthesis. Instead of doing any math inside those loops, the matmul function just says, okay, I need the value for position C.
How does it get it?
It called the dot product function we already wrote.
But dot product needs two lists.
Right. So matmul calls two more helper functions. One to go get row I from the first matrix, and another to get column J from the second matrix.
It passes those two extracted lists into dot product, which calculates that single number, and returns it cleanly back to fill the spot at C.
By breaking it down into those 5 logical steps, initialize, get row, get column, dot product, and the main structure, you manage the complexity. You avoid that index nightmare. That is the definition of good, robust code.
Okay, let's switch gears and dig into the ultimate power tool, recursion. This is probably the most common hurdle for programmers moving into more advanced territory.
Recursion is, at its heart, simply a function calling itself while returning a value. It's really the code implementation of a mathematical idea, a recurrence relation. It's where the solution to a big problem depends on the solution to smaller versions of the exact same problem.
It's different from a loop, which just goes step by step. Recursion sort of computes the next step based on the previous one. It creates this stack of pending jobs.
It does. And the absolute heart of the matter, the key to your formula sheet, is the base condition.
The stopping point.
The stopping point. It's the non-recursive case. It is the single thing that tells the function when to stop calling itself.
And if you forget it?
If you forget it, the function calls itself forever. It generates this mountain of pending operations that just overwhelms your computer's memory. You get a Stack Overflow error every time.
Let's try to visualize the flow for, say, the sum of the first n numbers. Let's use n4. The recursive formula is return n plus sum n1.
Okay, so when you call sum4, it doesn't calculate anything yet. It says, I need the result of sum3 first. It defers. Sum3 defers and calls sum2. Sum2 defers and calls sum. The stack is building up. We're waiting on 4 plus something, 3 plus something, 2 plus something.
Until you hit the base case, sum1, that finally returns a hard value, 1. That's the bottom of the stack.
And now the stack unwinds. Sum2 gets that 1 back, calculates 2 plus 1 is 3 and returns 3. Sum3 gets that 3 back, calculates 3 plus 3 is 6, returns 6. And finally, the original call, sum4, gets the 6, calculates 4 plus 6 is 10 and returns 10.
So all the actual addition happens as the values flow back up the stack?
Exactly.
A more complex one is compound interest, say 3 years at a 10% rate. The base case is the simplest known unit, which is the last year. So if years equals 1, return principal 1.1.
Right, and the recursive formula is return compound principal years 1, 1.1. The flow here is just brilliant because it forces the compounding to happen correctly. The function calls stack all the way down to the base case, the final year, and calculates the interest for that year first.
And as the return values flow back up the stack,
They are continuously multiplied by that 1.1 factor, applying the interest compounded on the now increasing principal for each year before it.
and just to round it out, factorial of 5. Base case is if n equals 1, return 1. Formula is return n factorial, n1.
It's very similar to the sum. The calls stack down to n equals 1. Then, as the stack unwinds, the multiplication happens. It resolves 1 times 2, then that result times 3, then times 4, then times 5. Recursion is just inherently powerful for things like traversing data structures, directories, trees, graphs, because the method for solving the problem at one node is the exact same method you need for all of its children.
So if we connect this all back to the bigger picture, you now have this essential formula sheet. You have function behavior scope, returning data, you have iterative logic for lists and matrices, and you have this sophisticated self-calling logic of recursion.
Mastering these few concepts, really, it allows you to tackle almost any major problem by just breaking it down into smaller, more manageable pieces.
When you look at a big programming challenge, your first thought should be, how can I use these tools to divide this problem until each little piece is trivial to solve?
That's the goal.
So what does this all mean? We talked a lot about how modularity made the matrix multiplication code readable. We broke it into 5 helper functions: initmat, dot product, row, column, and matmul. Now I want you to imagine you were forced to write that entire algorithm without those helpers, just raw nested loops in basic math. Go try to mentally trace how much harder it would be to keep track of which index I, J, or K corresponds to the current row you need, the column you need, and that intermediate dot product sum. That exercise will show you really vividly why effective programming isn't just about making code work. It's about making it understandable, making it debuggable through these dedicated modular functions. Go trace that index nightmare.